Hi, my name is Leo Sánchez, and today I will present the paper Theological Approaches to Migration, Their Impact on Missional Thinking and Action. Introduction. Three major theological and ethical approaches to migration today take as their starting point hospitality toward migrants, law and reform considerations concerning migrants, and the notion of special relationships with migrants. I call these approaches respectively the hospitality, legal, and relational approaches to migration. This presentation proceeds by outlining the main characteristics of the three theological approaches. Each model has a main starting point or focus, distinct biblical or theological sources that guide its reflections, some ethical framework for justice, as well as a way to conceive community or the church's role in society. Although I treat these models as discrete approaches, one should bear in mind that their proponents generally find ways of acknowledging and accommodating insights from others into their own proposals. In reality, the concerns of these heuristic models intersect, accounting for the complexity and messiness of everyday life. Yet I still think there is an advantage in drawing attention to the main themes and aims of each of the models. Highlighting their distinction from one another can help us to better understand the primary concerns of their proponents. I also like to suggest that each approach will have an impact on missional thinking and action. After reviewing the three approaches to migration, their strengths and limits, I will argue for a more comprehensive vocational approach to migration. The word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. Accordingly, a vocational approach to migration proposes that reflections on, decisions about, and forms of action toward migrant neighbors are realistically and primarily carried out according to or within one's vocations or callings in life. In the conclusion to the essay, I show the strengths and limits of this position. Let us begin with the hospitality model. The hospitality approach to immigration takes as its starting point immigrant neighbors, highlighting their human dignity, economic and family needs, and vulnerability to racism or discrimination, labor exploitation, and lack of due process. The model focuses on universal human rights that all people are or should be accorded simply because of their inherent dignity and value. This perspective also calls in a special way for the protection of those members of the human family who are most susceptible to losing those rights and ways of life leading to human flourishing due to wars, natural disasters, and racial, ethnic, political, religious, and other forms of persecution, oppression, or marginality. The hospitality model locates immigration questions along a spectrum that moves from hostility to hospitality toward immigrants. An example of this approach is biblical scholar Daniel Carroll's book, The Bible and Borders. Here, hospitality finds theological ground for a preferential option for immigrant neighbors in a number of biblical sources, such as the principle that human beings possess an inherent dignity by virtue of their being created in the image of God, imago Dei. Another common source are Old Testament stories of God's dealing with, protection of, and work through immigrants, such as Abraham, Joseph, Ruth, and Esther, to bless his people and ultimately the nations. Of central importance are Yahweh's commands to Israel and its leaders to remember, deal justly with, and include vulnerable resident aliens in their midst, because their forefathers and mothers too were once oppressed aliens in Egypt. In the Gospels, Jesus' own marginalized status as a refugee child and his self-identification with those outside the house of Israel and strangers serve as important insights calling for the church's solidarity with outsiders. Other New Testament teachings on hospitality to strangers, the church's inclusive missionary thrust and Catholicity, and her own eschatological identity as a resident alien in the world, provide further biblical foundations for extending a priority of love to immigrant neighbors today. In the hospitality approach, the aforementioned texts are used to support the universality of individuals' human rights, which includes the right to emigrate when conditions in people's countries are oppressive and do not promote their well-being. The model aligns well with a deontological vision of justice that focuses on the right exercise of duties on the basis of moral laws that are universally valid regardless of context or consequences. For instance, from a theological perspective, the imago Dei as the basis for human rights might be such a moral norm. In this case, the hospitality model also has an affinity with an egalitarian cosmopolitan vision of community, according to which one's duty to universal moral principles applies equally to all human persons in the global community without exception. Another example of an ethic of hospitality might be to argue, in a Christian context, that the preferential option for the poor principle as a universal moral duty follows from biblical commands to love needy neighbors, like widows, orphans, and aliens, because God has compassion for the vulnerable and disadvantaged. The key point is that these general duties to immigrants remain morally valid regardless of, say, their legal status in a nation state, since universal moral basis transcends the legal or political distinction between immigrants and citizens. When applied to global justice, egalitarian cosmopolitanism normally tends in the direction of calling for more non-restrictive and compassionate immigration policies, often based on humanitarian grounds, and a variety of arguments for more porous or open borders. What does the hospitality approach to immigration contribute to a theology and practice of mission? First, its cosmopolitan approach to the world as one human family has an affinity with the Church's missionary mandate to make disciples of all nations, and thus with the Church's Catholic or universal identity as a family of all tribes, languages, and nations. Second, its focus on universal moral principles grounded in Scripture or natural law, which apply to human persons on the basis of a common dignity as people created in God's image, for whom Christ died and rose again, aligns with the Church's evangelical concern for immigrant neighbors' spiritual needs, regardless of other conditions, such as their legal status. Third, by drawing attention to the vulnerability of immigrants and structural conditions that perpetuate their marginality, the hospitality approach reminds us of the importance of a holistic approach to mission that includes the whole person, and thus is inclusive of evangelism and justice. Finally, by reminding the Church of her own resident alien identity in the world and the persecution that at times comes to her because of her marginal status, the hospitality model moves the Church to empathize with immigrants in their suffering and marginality, and to remember that she herself has no permanent home on earth, but rather lives out her mission in the world in view of the coming of God's kingdom. Let's now move to the legal model. Unlike the hospitality model, which begins with the human dignity and needs of immigrant neighbors, the legal approach to immigration takes as its starting point immigration law in civil life. The model attends to the reality of nation states in today's world and the right of such sovereign states to exist as political entities or communities, comprised primarily of citizens that share certain values or characteristics in common, including form of government, values and ideals such as equality before the law, national histories and languages. It highlights the need for a regime to regulate and enforce the rule of law, the positive role of the state in securing justice and human rights for people within its boundaries, as well as the importance of a political process, such as a democratic one, to ensure the creation and revision of laws and policies, including those dealing with immigration, as needed. This model situates immigration questions along a spectrum of status categories that move from citizen to non-citizen concerns. The legal model focuses on biblical sources, especially in the New Testament, that draw on commands and exhortations to honor, pray for, and obey or submit to governing authorities, which are seen as divinely instituted instruments to carry out justice for the sake of order and peace in a world filled with sin. A recent example of this approach is the book Just Immigration by Mark Amstutz, a scholar in the field of international relations. Although governing authorities and institutions have the potential to be instruments of injustice and oppression as seen in dysfunctional states, a more balanced approach to the state shows how God can use even imperfect leaders and structures to accomplish good or proximate justice in a world where sin and self-interest are unavoidable. In the legal approach, the distinction between what Caesar is owed and what God is owed is used to distinguish between the Christian's life in two cities, his or her dual identity in the world. In matters concerning the heavenly city, God works in the world through the church and her gospel message to bring about the inclusion of all people without distinction into his kingdom through faith in Christ. In the earthly city, by contrast, God works through governments to bring about, even if imperfectly, a measure of justice in society for all people, whether Christian or not, through the enactment, enforcement, and adaptations of laws and public policies. In the heavenly city, there is no need for government or law because divine love rules. But in the earthly city, government and law is needed to apply justice among individuals with their own competing claims. Proponents of the legal approach often argue that hospitality approaches tend to confuse the aims of these two cities, conflate love with justice, and therefore focus one-sidedly on the church's compassion toward immigrants without thinking more thoroughly about other issues nations have to deal with, such as the relationship between citizens and immigrants in policy, or the legitimacy of sovereign states to regulate immigration. The legal model advocates for the church to use scripture and theological reflection as a basis to articulate a moral compass for discussion on immigration, but is careful about justifying specific policy claims directly on such basis, especially if such claims politicize the church to such an extent that she loses her moral authority to offer foundational guidance on ethics. In the contemporary U.S. context, the legal approach assumes the reality of nation-states and its political structures in the modern world as the primary institutional means through which citizens can advance human rights, while also exercising their rights of self-governance in a constitutional liberal democracy. The model aligns with a contractarian approach to justice, according to which people, by virtue of living under the same regime, have entered into an implicit or explicit social contract with each other that calls them to give ethical priority to the inequalities present among neighbors in their own communities before considering other more global forms of inequality. In contrast to the cosmopolitan view of community, the legal approach tends to hold a communitarian view of the world, according to which people within nation-states, with their corresponding views of what constitutes community, have a right to exercise in their laws and policies a preferential option for citizens, including the neediest among their own, before engaging immigrant needs. When applied to global justice, contractarian communitarianism tends to favor more restrictive immigration policies, such as greater border enforcement and various arguments for closed borders, except for a limited number of exceptional but morally compelling cases, such as the situation of refugees. What might a legal approach to immigration contribute to a theology and practice of mission? First, the focus on law and policy encourages reflection beyond a general love or preferential option for the immigrant toward more specific discussions on legal solutions to immigration issues, showing how theological ethics translates into concrete, even if contested, policy considerations. Such engagement shows respect for the rule of law, which involves not only enforcing already existing laws, but also making laws better, more adequate, and just for all neighbors involved. At the micro level, church members can become more informed about immigration law, its possibilities, its complexities, and even brokenness, so that they can see how best they can realistically and concretely assist immigrants in their churches and communities who find themselves in ambiguous legal circumstances. Second, a preferential option for citizens in nation states raises a key question that is often bypassed in hospitality approaches, namely, how should policy considerations in immigration account for the distinction and relationship between citizens and immigrants? How might immigration policy, for instance, deal with a diversity of issues that are important to citizens, ranging from human rights and family unity to economic, labor, and border enforcement concerns? There's a whole range here of issues that need debating when thinking about immigration policy. At the micro level, this knowledge should lead to civil and rich conversations about a complex issue with members of our churches who might be concerned with or influenced by only one set of issues. Third, the legal approach and its presupposition that Christian identity is lived in two cities can remind us that our disagreements on immigration law in the earthly city should not get in the way of our unity in Christ in the heavenly city. Finally, the same distinction reminds us that our disagreements on immigration law should never get in the way of the mission of the church, the proclamation of the gospel, as well as her works of mercy and justice among and with immigrant neighbors. We now move to the relational model. The relational approach to immigration begins neither with the universal principle of love for immigrant neighbors on the basis of their inherent or given dignity, nor with the rights of citizens of nation states to enact immigration law through their elected governing authorities. But rather, it begins with relationships with immigrants. A current example of this approach is the book Migrants and Citizens by Tisha Rajendra, a scholar in the field of theological ethics. The relational model asks not only what general duties someone might have toward their immigrant neighbors with whom they share a common humanity, as in the hospitality model, or toward their citizen neighbors with whom they share the bonds of nationhood, as in the legal model. Instead, the relational model first asks what special or particular relationships we might have with migrants, and then discerns what specific responsibilities we might have toward them on the basis of such relationships. Applied to immigration, its main concern lies in global relationships between citizens and migrants initiated by host nations, especially colonial, guest worker, and foreign investment-driven migrations. The relational model frames immigration questions along a spectrum of priorities and responsibilities that moves in concentric circles of proximity, from neighbors who stand closest to us at the center of the circle to those who stand farthest away from the center, highlighting especially those migrants who are closely related to citizens. In the relational model, biblical sources dealing with Yahweh's commands to Israel to love resident aliens, because their ancestors were aliens in Egypt, reappear. But unlike the hospitality approach, these texts are not read primarily as universal ideas or general duties placed upon all people. Instead, these commands are seen as descriptive of a specific relationship that links Israelites to resident aliens, and therefore demands particular commitments and protections toward them, such as hunger alleviation, fair wages, rest or Sabbath from work, inclusion in the community's harvest feast, and equal standing and protection in disputes. These texts are then not a prescriptive blueprint for defining the relationship between U.S. citizens and immigrants today, but rather a descriptive picture of a relationship between a nation and its resident aliens that invites us to ask what types of responsibilities we should have toward migrants in our own context. Such relationships might change from one country to another depending on a number of factors, such as the nature of bilateral arrangements between nations that are driving migration. The vision of justice that best aligns with the relational approach is one that defines justice as right relationships between neighbors. When these relationships have been broken, justice requires a commitment to make them right again by fulfilling specific responsibilities. Although helpful in terms of deterring human rights abuses, the cosmopolitan view of the hospitality model is nevertheless too broad for specific responsibilities to be named and fulfilled toward immigrants. Indeed, the relational approach welcomes the hospitality model's insight into the vulnerability of immigrants and the structural injustices that often victimize them. But it also holds that the focus on hospitality to poor and bystander strangers in need of our generosity does not accurately reflect the agency of immigrants as close neighbors whose presence and activity in the nation already puts them in a relationship with its citizens. The communitarian view, on the other hand, tends to frame political life mostly in terms of responsibilities among citizens of the nation state, but does not deal more robustly with questions concerning responsibilities of citizens toward migrants created by inherited relationships that come from global arrangements, such as colonial or foreign interventions, guest worker programs, and investments abroad. What then might be some payoffs of the relational model of immigration for a theology and practice of mission? First, in contrast to the cosmopolitan tone of the hospitality model, it moves beyond the discourse of loving immigrants in general toward naming our specific relationships with immigrants and our mutual commitments. Second, in contrast to the communitarian tone of the legal model, the relational approach moves us beyond narratives that reduce strangers to outsiders vis-a-vis citizens of nation states. It asks whether there are deeper historic structural relationships between host nations and migrants that need to be told, and in some cases make the immigrant a much closer neighbor than we might initially think. At the micro level, these contributions allow us to put a human face on the issue of immigration. It warns against reducing immigrants' experiences to one-sided narratives. They are not just victims of unjust structures, but agents with their own hopes and dreams. They're not just economic migrants or the poor, but also the politically and religiously persecuted and people seeking to reunite with their families. They're not strangers, far from us in every case, but often close neighbors. The relational model invites us to listen more deeply to immigrants' own stories of migration, so that we can then also tell their stories more faithfully in the national debate, and so that these stories can then inform our theology and practice of mission. As an example, present-day family migration patterns initiated by a host country's past colonial policies may commit churches from such country who did mission work in former colonies to advocate for the protection of those migrating families who also happen to be members of their churches in either country. Here, responsibilities of citizens to migrant neighbor follow from migration patterns with roots in prior historic relationships, even if such relationships are often forgotten, ignored, or denied by the citizens of a nation. We now move to my own proposal, which I call a vocational approach to migration. As a supplement to the hospitality, legal, and relational models, I would like to propose this vocational approach. Vocation, as I stated earlier, comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. In theological terms, vocations are callings that God has given all creatures, and particularly Christians, to serve neighbors. Through such vocations or callings, Christians become what the reformer Martin Luther called masks of God in the world. That is to say, instruments through which God cares for his creation. As God's co-workers, they cooperate with the Creator in his continuous work to provide for neighbors in various ways. The biblical inspiration for this model is, broadly speaking, texts in which God calls his people into his kingdom so that he might fulfill his purposes in creation through their witness in word and deed. As an example, 1 Peter 2 describes the Christian life in the world as an embodiment of God's call to Israel to be a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. A call that is fulfilled among Jesus' disciples when a people for his own possession proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. This calling makes the church a nation of sojourners and exiles in the world, a spirit-led people who abstain from the passions of the flesh and live honorable lives among the Gentiles, so that their good deeds may lead others to glorify God. God's calling or vocation does not mean only church vocation or professional church work, although it certainly includes that. More broadly, God's callings or vocations are lived out by the priesthood of believers in many ways. In fact, every Christian does not only have one, but a variety of vocations. These vocations can be more formally thought of as offices or stations from which we serve others in many spheres of life, such as family, civic engagement, and church. For instance, in the family sphere, I am a son, a brother, a husband, and a father. In civic life, I am a resident of the city of Brentwood, Missouri, a double bass player with the St. Louis Civic Orchestra, and a citizen of 2 countries. In the church, I am an ordained minister, a teacher, a theologian, and a director of a formation program for U.S. Latino students and Latina students, which offers a Master of Arts track students in Latin America and the Caribbean can also apply to. In each of those callings, offices, or stations, I have many and various types of relationships with neighbors, which entail specific responsibilities toward them that in turn define or shape my service in the world. Indeed, what it means to be called by God. The vocational model forces me to approach ethical issues such as immigration from my vocational location. That is to say, from the callings I have been given to serve a variety of neighbors. The vocational model grounds the content or the that of justice in God's moral law, summed up in the 10 Commandments, which include honoring authorities, honor your father and mother, as well as promoting the well-being of neighbors in need, do not murder. In this way, it can align with the hospitality model's theological view of justice as commitment to universal duties held in common by all persons. However, since God's commandments are universal in scope, there needs to be a way to make their fulfillment realistic, given our Christianly limitations. Otherwise, the moral law becomes abstract and its fulfillment idealistic. Here is where vocation helps us to contextualize in concrete ways the fulfillment of the law. Vocation moves us toward the how of the law, its application, making justice possible for some concrete who or neighbor. The moral law calls us to love the neighbor. But if everyone is my neighbor in general, then no one is my neighbor in particular. By focusing on responsibilities towards specific neighbors, the vocational approach, like the relational model, wants to define what it means to fulfill the law of love concretely, moving us away from general principles of justice to putting a face on justice. In contextualizing justice, the vocational model, for instance, can accommodate the legal model's contractarian view of justice as fulfillment to the demands of a social contract among citizens of a nation. However, the vocational view does not reduce justice to such contracts simply because being a citizen is only one of many vocations Christians hold. One might not only relate to migrants as a citizen, but also as a family or church member. The contextual approach to justice in the vocational view relates more closely to the relational model's view of justice as responsibility to make and nurture right or just relationships. But unlike the emphasis of the relational model of immigration on the global relationship between citizens and migrants due to prior arrangements by the host nation, the vocational model is more inclusive of other vocations beyond that of citizen, from which Christians may also ask what responsibilities they might have toward migrants. For example, over the years, I have taught students who have had undocumented family members. They do not merely approach these immigrants from the vocation of citizen, but also as spouses and children, parents and grandparents. It follows that the vocational model can be cosmopolitan or communitarian in its approach to the world, depending on the sphere of activities and neighbors I attend to in each vocation. The scope of my vocation can be transnational or national, global or local in scope, depending on the reach of each vocation. For instance, my vocation as a director of a formation and graduate program in the Spanish language for service in the church means I have responsibilities to immigrant neighbors in this country, local, and also to foreign nationals in Latin American countries, global. Vocations then become the means through which I serve a multitude of neighbors, including immigrants, giving focus to the fulfillment of the law and the practice of just relationships. On account of our limitations and the impossible task to love all neighbors, vocation is liberating because it makes our options for engagement more focused and realistic by prioritizing which neighbors to advocate for first. This focus channels our energies to defend those neighbors we have been especially called to serve. Paradoxically, the vocational model also admits that there are others whose vocations might lead them to defend different neighbors and advocate for other legitimate and competing issues that also require attention. This reality helps explain in part why, in the immigration debate, there are competing priorities given by various constituencies to issues such as family unification, worker visas, labor and economic issues, path to legalization, and border security. Everyone is ideally, at least, arguing from some vocational context and advocating for the issues that they believe affect their particular neighbors. Like the legal and relational models of migration, vocational location assumes the messiness of life, where competing claims and advocacy for the needs of various neighbors intersect and at times collide in society. In terms of the theology and practice of mission, the vocational approach encourages us to ask how our vocations, offices, or stations in life might connect us in some way to immigrant neighbors. Like the relational model, it will ask what responsibilities follow from such vocational engagement or positioning. For instance, as a U.S. citizen, I might choose an approach to immigration law that deals fairly with a sovereign nation's just enforcement, and at the same time accounts for and rewards the contributions that immigrants make to the nation. In a different vocation, say my vocation as a church teacher who works with immigrants and knows their struggles, I might write and deliver theological papers on immigration, like the ones I'm delivering now, to guide churches in their holistic work of evangelism and justice among immigrants. Or I can also engage in collective vocation, joining forces with other Christians who share a similar concern for displaced persons in society. For example, I can support a parachurch, refugee resettlement, and immigrant advocacy agency with my donations. Admittedly, while the vocational approach could be conveniently used to exclude immigrant neighbors because they do not immediately fit in my vocations, others who are in closer proximity to immigrants will still advocate for them, and in so doing, perhaps persuade others that there is a case for caring about them and their families, because they're a significant sector of the population, indeed, of our communities and churches, which means that a vocational model should allow for a healthy dose of the hospitality model, so that vocation is not used as an excuse to avoid immigrant neighbors who might be invisible to us, but are in reality all around us. In some ways, the vocational model is the most comprehensive of the major theological approaches to migration in the U.S. today, because it can account for all neighbors, including immigrants and citizens, as seen through the specific lens of a plurality of competing but also intersecting vocations in family, civil, and church life with local and global scopes. Thank you very much.